everybody. Good morning. Welcome to our very exciting session. It's on healthcare. So before we start, I'm Sheikh Iqbal Ahmed. I go by my middle name. I'm the General Chair of IEEE Digital Health for this conference. Today, it's my honor and privilege to present one of our keynotes. Her name is Dr. Jianying Hu. She is IBM Fellow, Global Science Leader, AI for Healthcare, and Director of Healthcare and Life Science Research at IBM. She is also Adjunct Professor at School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She has conducted and led extensive research in machine learning, data mining, statistical pattern recognition, signal processing with applications to healthcare analytics, medical informatics, business analytics, multimedia content analysis, with recent focus in AI technologies for accelerated discovery, particularly for biomarkers. She has published over 150 peer-reviewed scientific articles. She holds 50 patents, 50 patents. She served as chair of Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining Working Group of American Medical Informatics Association from 2014 to 16. Also Computational Science Advisory Board of Michael J. Fox Foundation from 2017 to 18. She has served as associate editor for many journals, including IEEE TIP, Pattern Recognition. Currently, she serves on the Journals and Publication Committee of EMEA, editorial board of JAMIA Open, and the advisory board of JHIR. She is also external advisory board of Vanderbilt University Department of Biomedical Informatics, external advisory board of NIH AIM AHEAD program, National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She is establishing, in that committee, establishing a framework for the emerging science, technology, and innovation, particularly in healthcare and medicine. She is a fellow of American College of Medical Informatics, IEEE, International Association of Pattern Recognition, and so on. She received Asian American Engineers of the World 2013. So it's a really honor and privilege for us at IEEE Services Congress to have her here as a keynote speaker. Let's welcome Dr. Hu.
All right, thank you very much, Ibo, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. So with all the buzz around AI foundation models and generative technologies, we are clearly at a momentous juncture for AI in general, and AI for healthcare life sciences is no exception. So it's really timely that we take the opportunity of this IEEE World Congress to assess, reflect, and look to the future. And I'm delighted to be part of this collective exercise. To do that, I'm going to first take a step back to share with you our general approach to AI for healthcare and life sciences, and our recent focus on accelerated discovery with some concrete examples to give you some context. I'll then share with you our thoughts on this new wave of AI technologies, including AI foundation models and generative technologies. What does it mean? What does it take to take these technologies beyond large language models to drive scientific discovery in healthcare and life sciences spaces? All right. So AI for healthcare and life sciences, in essence, really is all about enabling the journey from data to impact. By data here, we are referring to all kinds of data collected from anywhere within the healthcare and life sciences ecosystem. And as we all know, both the type and the quantity of the data has been rapidly increasing. And the ultimate impact that we seek to achieve in applying AI to all of these different types of data is enhanced health outcome. So the most important principle for AI researchers in order to build AI models that can truly drive scientific discoveries that lead to enhanced health outcomes is really to go deep into the domain by working closely with domain experts. So to that end, so that we can really fully understand the use cases and working with the domain experts to identify the most important problems to solve and then bring the right type of AI models to solve those problems. So to that end, we have been collaborating extensively with many different partners within the healthcare life sciences ecosystem, from premier care providers and biomedical research institutions to leading edge pharma companies, to scientific research foundations, to top universities and research institutions and government agencies. And in collaboration with these partners, we have been publishing extensively in top science and clinical journals, as you see some of the examples on the right-hand side. So this really, along with many others, we have generated a lot of proof points that demonstrate the caliber of scientific discoveries that can be enabled by AI technologies by working together with domain experts. And so now, more recently, we have turned our attention to accelerated discovery, meaning how do we build AI technologies to enable these type of scientific discoveries at greater speed and scale. So as we all know, AI can be used to drive discovery across the healthcare ecosystem and enhance the process in many different ways. But in today's talk, I'm going to focus on examples and perspectives from the angle of biomedical research and therapeutic discovery. So as we all know, drug discovery is a very long and costly process. It on average takes 10 to 15 years and $1.5 to $2 billion to take a drug to market. And we believe AI can be really used to enhance the efficiency and efficacy across this drug development pipeline, all the way from target identification to post-market analysis. And here highlighted in yellow are just some of the concrete examples of what AI can do throughout this whole pipeline. So AI can be from the left-hand side. AI can be used to help the computational generation of new molecular entities through novel generative models, as well as computational screening tools. It can also be used to identify novel indications for existing drugs, this notion of drug repurposing. This can improve the efficiency of drug discovery because then you can skip some of the early steps of drug discovery. Furthermore, a lot of the computational methods and models developed in the context of drug repurposing, for example, causal inference methods, as well as biomedical network analysis, can also be used to shed lights on the mechanisms of disease and disease progression, and from there generate hypotheses for new targets. AI can also be very useful in enhancing the safety and efficacy profiling of new therapeutic candidates, so that you can use that to enhance the de-risking of these candidates, for example, through PK/PD analysis and dosing analysis. And by connecting basically the potential mechanisms of action to experimental outcomes. And moving to the right-hand side, AI is also critical in the discovery of multimodal biomarkers for the purpose of identifying sub-disease phenotypes. Some of these sub-disease phenotypes might be overlapping across many diseases, which currently are mostly defined by symptoms, right? So by discovering these underlying sub-disease phenotypes, which are more likely connected to mechanisms, we can generate hypotheses for new and potentially more effective targets. Another related area of where AI can come in to help is disease staging. So here AI can provide longitudinal models to help better assess, characterize the different disease stages as well as progression, so that from there we can, again, generate hypotheses for targets, but also to provide ways to better assess the efficacy of therapeutics in the context of that disease progression. And finally, combining AI algorithms for biomarker discovery and disease staging together with other AI tools such as synthetic cohort generation as well as digital monitoring. These AI technologies can really enhance clinical trials so that we can provide more accurate and meaningful assessments of the true effect of therapeutics on disease progression. All right, so in the next part of the talk, I'm going to give some concrete examples from these set of technologies that we have developed so that we can assess what are the learnings that we can take from these examples that we can carry forward as we continue to explore the new wave of AI technologies. So the first example I'm going to give is in the area of computational drug discovery. So here, in this work that was published last year, we worked on basically coming up with better ways of representing protein sequences so that they can be fed into machine learning models to drive more effective ways of predicting affinity, binding affinity, as well as to perform de novo generation of new drug candidates. So these are two critical tasks in computational drug discovery. So what we did here is we came up with a novel way of representing protein sequences that focuses on active binding site residues instead of the whole protein sequence. We apply this representation to then this family of kinase proteins for the discovery of kinase inhibitors, which is an important class of drugs for cancer treatments. And we demonstrated, as you see on the right-hand side, that using this new form of representation, we were able to achieve significantly enhanced performance for affinity prediction. And then when it comes to de novo generation, we demonstrated that this representation can lead to significant speed up of the generation of binding ligands without sacrificing the performance as measured by the binding affinity. And by our analysis of the result demonstrated that this enhanced performance is likely because by focusing on the active binding site residues in our representation instead of looking at the whole sequence, we were able to bring in stronger inductive bias about the 3D structure of the protein. So this points to the importance of 3D information in computational drug discovery, and we are continuing to enhance this approach by coming up with even stronger 3D representations as we start to create specialized foundation models for drug discovery. Next example is about drug repurposing. So here the goal is to build scalable machine learning engines that can be used to analyze retrospective observational data in order to identify drugs where that have a desirable effect on an outcome that's not originally indicated for that drug, right? So this, again, as I mentioned earlier, can really enhance the efficiency of drug discovery so that you can now skip some of the early stages of drug discovery. However, if you just compare the outcomes over treated versus not treated cohorts extracted directly from the observational data, you're likely to get many, many false positives because of the confounding effects, right? So these confounding effects are really inevitable when you work with observational data, because these data, this kind of data is very different from the carefully controlled clinical trial data. While there are many causal inference methods that have been created over the years to address the confounding factors when you try to derive insights from observational data, still hypothesis generation for drug repurposing has to date been very ad hoc, labor-intensive and time-consuming. So to address this challenge, we have created a set of machine learning tools to make this type of insights generation more scalable and more systematic. In this work that was published 2 years ago, in a collaboration with Teva, we applied this scalable machine learning pipeline to a cohort of Parkinson's disease patients, and we were able to identify 2 drug candidates that have potential effect in preventing dementia in Parkinson's disease patients. And many of the computational tools that we developed in this pipeline have now been open sourced, and it's now driving a very active community on GitHub. And we're also in active collaboration with Cleveland Clinic to apply this methodology to many, many different disease areas. All right. So the next example I want to talk about is this notion of hybrid modeling for disease and drug mechanisms. So mechanistic models of biological systems, such as tissues, are powerful tools to drive better de-risking of early stages of drug development through, as I mentioned earlier, PK/PD analysis and dosing analysis. However, this type of mechanistic models are typically very complex, and it's often very difficult to infer the parameters of these mechanistic models in such a way that the resulting model, the results that you generate from that model, actually match outcomes that you observe in the in vitro lab experiments, which tend to be very heterogeneous, right? So to address this challenge, we brought in machine learning algorithms. In this particular case, it's generative adversarial networks, or GANs, to perform this inverse inference to infer the parameters of a mechanistic model based on the data that's observed in lab experiments. And again, in this work that was published last year, we applied this approach to in vitro cardiac mechanics model data, and used this approach to infer parameters in a cardiac tissue model. So in the figure that you see in the middle of the right-hand side, you can see the comparison between the actual experimental data against data that's generated through simulations using this model, where we infer the parameters using this hybrid approach. And as you can see, the data that's generated from the model matches the experimental data really well. And an analysis of the 7 mechanistic parameters that was inferred using these AI methods in this mechanistic tissue model generated a lot of really interesting insights into the potential mechanism of this particular drug that's listed here. So we're now looking to enhance this method by applying more the latest new types of AI generative models, such as diffusion models, and looking at ways of connecting this type of models with foundation models in our next wave of technologies. All right, so now moving more to the right-hand side, I'm going to talk about disease progression modeling. So here, the challenge is that many chronic conditions really evolve over a long period of time, and very often that this progression is very heterogeneous. Different patients tend to experience different symptoms in different order for different time durations, and this makes it very difficult to pinpoint which particular stage the patient is at, and what is the likely trajectory. This is particularly difficult for early stages of disease progression when the symptoms are more subtle and also more varied. That early stage of disease progression is actually where most of our efforts in drug development are focused on right now, because this is when you are more likely to arrest disease progression, right, before it becomes too late. So to solve this challenge, we have been developing a suite of machine learning models to learn from large amount of longitudinal data that we have now available for many, many different chronic conditions, to derive machine learning-based disease progression models. So as you can see on the chart on the upper left-hand side, we start with a open source, again, platform, which we call DPM360, that's designed to drive scalable training and validation of many different types of disease progression models. And then on top of this platform, we have been investigating many different ways of learning representations and driving feature embeddings. And then on top of that, we have been building many different types of disease progression models designed to drive, to address many different questions that's being raised in this process of understanding disease progression. And we have applied this platform now to many different disease areas, working with many different partners. So what I'm going to do next is to give you 3 examples where we have successfully developed one particular type of disease progression that's based on variations of hidden Markov models. So here, in this type of models, we did not use the encoder-decoder type of transformer-based architecture, which is one characteristic of foundation models. However, these models are trained using self-supervised learning, which is another hallmark of foundation models. And in the 3 examples that I'm going to give next, we have collaborated with 3 different scientific research institutions and apply this model to 3 different disease areas. So it really serves as a good example of how scalable AI technologies can be used to support communities of discovery to drive meaningful discoveries in the healthcare and life sciences space. So the first example is Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a devastating neurodegenerative condition with that's caused by a single gene mutation. So it's very easy to diagnose. But on the other hand, the manifestation of this disease is very complex. It has many, many different dimensions, has the motor dimension, has cognitive dimension, has also the functional dimension, right? So for this reason, even though a lot of data have been collected over the years, past efforts to using that data to build disease progression models has been largely limited to focusing on one particular aspect at a time, and also making use of data coming out of one set of a study at a time. And this is because traditional statistical methods really have challenges tracking the progression of the disease over these multiple dimensions of manifestation at the same time. So what we have done is, in collaboration with CHDI, which is a scientific research foundation that focuses on finding cure for Huntington's disease, and we applied a probabilistic disease progression modeling approach based on a variation of hidden Markov models, as I mentioned earlier, to many different sets of disease registries that have been collected over the years. And we were able to then derive an integrated Huntington's disease progression model that take into consideration all the measurements across all these different dimensions and arrive at a model that captures the whole disease progression all the way from pre-onset to late stage. And a couple of things I would like to point out for this model is, number one, it's completely self-supervised. The model learns from the data, the number of states that's most appropriate for this particular disease based on the data that's observed. It also automatically learns the characteristics of each one of these states as represented by conditional distributions of these different clinical assessments at each state. And on top of that, it automatically learns transition probabilities between each one of these identified states over any given period of time, right? And finally, once that model is trained, you can also apply the model to patients, both existing patients as well as new patients that the model has not seen, and use that model to assess what is the most likely state at each point of this when the patient encounters with a healthcare system, all the way up to the current visit. And on top of that, also provide projections into the future in terms of what kind of path the patient is likely to take based on not just where the patient is at currently, but also the path that patient has been taken up to the current point. So again, in this paper that was published last year in Movement Disorders, which is a top journal around neurodegenerative conditions, we demonstrate the results that comes out of this modeling exercise, right? So we identified 9 distinct disease states that's discovered by training over data coming from 4 different prospective observational studies. This 9-state model covers the complete disease progression that spans about 4 decades. And one thing I would like to point out here is none of the 4 observational data sets actually has data that covers this whole 40-year duration of disease progression, right? Because each one of these disease registries and observational studies tend to focus on a particular part of this progression, and none of these studies last 40 years long, right? So, but because of the probabilistic nature of this training framework, we were able to essentially stitch together data coming from these different registries and build this end-to-end disease progression model that captures all these different aspects of disease manifestation. And the plot that you see underneath demonstrates some of these more subtle and complex patterns that this model is able to capture, because if you look at this, it actually captures patterns where these measurements in the different dimensions move in different ways, right? Depending on where the patient is, which stage the patient is at. And then on the lower right-hand side, you can see example coming from one particular patient for whom we have a long history, over 15 years. But using the integrated disease progression model, you're able to capture much more subtle changes in this patient and capture the moment right before the patient transition into more serious manifestation, compared to what you see on the right-hand side, which is the standard clinical assessment that's in use now, which is very granular, which is very course level and doesn't provide as much detailed information, and therefore is, our integrated model provides more insights that can be used to help the physicians assess where the patient is at and better assess what kind of treatments and what kind of measurements are most important for the patient at this moment. And this model is also being used to explore ways of identifying the most appropriate patient to enroll in a clinical trial, depending on which stage of the disease the new therapeutic candidate is targeting, right? So the second disease area that we apply this similar type of model, again, a variation of hidden marker model to, is Parkinson's disease. So this is another neurodegenerative condition, again, very complex with many different manifestations and a lot of variations over time, right? So this is another situation where it's important to be able to come up with a model that's capable of taking into consideration of all these different measurements at once, and to be able to capture these very heterogeneous progression pathways. And in the case of Parkinson's disease, we have a additional challenge compared to Huntington's disease, in that, unlike in Huntington's disease case, where there's no medication available even to address effectively the symptoms, Parkinson's disease, there are medications, even though there's still no medication that can modify the progression. there are medications that are effective in controlling the symptoms of the disease, particularly tremor type of symptoms. So this actually creates a masking effect that makes tracking of disease progression even more difficult because, for example, you could have two patients who are, one of them responds very well to a particular medication that controls tremor, whereas another patient doesn't respond well to this medication, even though both patients are at the same stage of disease progression. Right? So to address this challenge, we used a different variation of hidden Markov models. In this case, it's input-output hidden Markov models, where we use that additional mechanism to address to account for the effect of medication on the manifestation of the disease. And we designed the mechanism in such a way that we take into consideration that the impact of that medication can be different for different disease states, and they can also be different for different patients. So it's personalized. Right? So in this paper that I show here that came out 2 years ago in the Lancet Digital Health, we reported finding there in applying this model, we identified in this case 8 disease states with, again, that allowed many very important insights to be derived from this model that can be used to then guide the understanding of the potential different progression pathways of Parkinson's disease patients. And again, from their deeper understanding of the mechanism and potential targets. So the last example that I want to show in disease progression modeling is, in this case, where we have applied it to type 1 diabetes progression. And in this particular case, it's really tracking the progression in high-risk children before the actual onset of type 1 diabetes, right? So here we collaborated with JDRF, and through JDRF, we also collaborated with 5 different research institutions around the world, each with its own observational study with a lot of data collected. As you see on the right-hand side, it's very rich data. And the goal is to really understand the evolution of this particular biomarker, which is islet autoimmune antibodies, the progression of these, the impact of the progression of these antibodies on the progression of towards the onset of type 1 diabetes, for the purpose of, number one, being able to devise better screening policies so that these children don't end up getting diagnosed in emergency rooms, which could have life-threatening consequences. And also, again, to be able to better enroll patients into a lot of clinical trials that are being pursued now for potential therapeutics that can prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes. So we have already, this collaboration, very large collaboration, have led to many interesting findings, and we have a lot of publications. But in this particular example that came out in Nature Communications last year, we, again, combined the hidden Markov model type of machine learning models that I just described, in this case also with a novel visualization tool to allow the researchers to basically probe and investigate these different disease progression pathways, right? So in this case, the model identified these 3 distinct trajectories, and our analysis then later showed that each trajectory has distinct characteristics in terms of the risk of onset of type 1 diabetes as well as time to onset. And as you can see, each one has distinct states. And this is, the clinical researchers that we have been collaborating with are very excited about these findings, because that is really the beginning of being able to identify these intrinsic differences in progressions in terms of, out of all these different autoimmune antibodies, what the different patterns in terms of the which autoimmune antibody comes first, the duration between the appearance of these antibodies, and some of them tend to disappear after a certain period of time. What does it all mean in terms of the likelihood of progression as well as the time to progression? And from there, we can hope to identify deeper insights into the mechanism, which again can lead to discoveries of new targets. All right, so the last example that I want to touch on is an early attempt towards cross-modal learning to arrive at richer representations for disease and health states, right? So in healthcare life sciences, just like in many other domains, currently most of the machine learning models are developed in a very independent way, and so each model tend to be siloed in terms of the data it uses, in terms of the features that gets extracted, and the specific model that gets developed, right? Now, increasingly, there's a need for us to be able to combine multiple modalities to come up with a more holistic representation. And this type of representation has two important advantages. Number one is it can help to overcome the intrinsic bias and limits within each individual modality so that we can be more likely to arrive at a more intrinsic representation. And secondly is such representation is more likely to capture foundational knowledge, which then can be used to drive multiple downstream tasks, which makes the model development more scalable and also more feasible, right? So this second aspect is where foundation models of the kind that has been used to create the large language models has been very successful in achieving. However, to date, only with very limited modalities, right? So basically text and image. So the example that I show here that was published very recently, just a month ago in Nature Communications, represents a step towards the larger vision of arriving at multimodal representations with modalities beyond text. Okay, so in this case, this is a collaboration with Broad and MIT. And here, what we're getting at is to arrive at a more holistic representation of cardiovascular state. And the two modalities that we experimented with is one is the clinical modality that's represented by ECG. So this is a very routine measure and very inexpensive. And the second modality is cardiac MRI, which provides much more information about the structure of the heart. But at the same time, it's extremely expensive and it's not routinely collected. Right? So our goal is to see, can we come up with a way to do cross-modality learning to arrive at a richer representation? So what we did here is to achieve this cross-modal training, we first trained two different encoders for each one of these two modalities, right? So here we use the standard encoder-decoder architecture, which is the same architecture behind transformer type of technologies as behind the large language models that we are now very familiar with. But once we have encoded these different modalities, we then map them into a joint latent space. So the key of the cross-modal learning is really in this joint latent space, right? So in order to achieve this joint representation, we use the contrastive learning approach. So here, this joint representation is trained using paired samples of ECG and cardiac MRI from about 40,000 patients that's extracted from UK Biobank, which is a publicly available data set, right? So using contrastive learning, what we do is to incorporate a contrastive loss in that loss function so that we can ensure that paired samples of ECG and MRI from the same patient get mapped in close to each other in that joint latent space. Right? So once this joint latent space is learned, we can then construct, again, different decoders to reconstruct each modality. But then this joint latent space can also be used to directly drive predictive models for different downstream tasks. Right? So one thing that I want to point out is even though to train this joint latent space, we require samples that have both ECG and MRI data. Once this representation is learned, we can then use an individual modality. You don't require both modalities in order to tap into this latent space to drive downstream tasks, right? So this is very significant because that means you can leverage the rich representation that's achieved through cross-modality learning without having to necessarily always, have the more expensive and less accessible modality, right? So to demonstrate this, to test out this hypothesis, we ran experiments across a large number of downstream prediction tasks, as you see here, for phenotypes. Some of them are phenotypes that's traditionally defined using the MRI modality. Some are phenotypes that's traditionally defined using the ECG modality. And as you can see across the board, the machine learning models that's built on the the representation that's learned from cross-model training achieves enhanced performance across the board. Most importantly, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, this is phenotypes that's defined using MRI traditionally. So it's all those measures that you see are measures of the structure of the heart that you can really traditionally only able to derive from MRI data. But the results that show on the upper right-hand side are machine learning models that's built using ECG as input only, while tapping into the latent space that has been trained using the both modalities. So that's one evidence that shows that you can indeed tap into the benefit of these cross-modal representations using the more accessible and actually less comprehensive modality. Another further validation of this hypothesis is a reconstruction and generative experiment that we did. In this case, we looked at this particular phenotype that's, again, traditionally derived from MRIs. This is LVM. And we show here two representative patients, one with high LVM, one with low LVM on the right-hand side. And for each patient, what you see here are the comparison of, on the one hand, on the left-hand side is basically translation from LCG to MRI, right? So in this case, we only provide the model as input, the ECG data. But then by tapping into the latent space, we then construct or generate a MRI image, right? And then on the right-hand side is the reconstruction scenario where the input to the model is the original MRI image, and then it gets mapped to the latent space, and then the MRI image gets reconstructed. So that's more a reconstruction task. So if you compare the translation task to the reconstruction task, you can see in both cases, the translation case where the MRI image is really synthesized based on the input signal from ECG, even though it has lower resolution compared to the true MRI construction, it actually captures the phenotype very well. If you look at the space that's marked by the right lines, the red curves, right? So the large LVM as well as the low LVM as well as the high LVM, that characteristics is really preserved. So that's another evidence that you can, again, tap into the benefits of this rich cross-model representation without having to use the more expensive modality. And this has really very important implications, right, on the accessibility of the machine learning models that we're building. So that concludes the examples that I wanted to walk you through here, just to give you the context, right? So as you can see, we have already created a lot of proof of concepts in terms of what kind of, how machine learning and scalable AI technologies can be used to drive meaningful discoveries in healthcare and life sciences. Now, the question is, how do we further scale this up? So not surprisingly, we turn to foundation models, right? So foundation models and generative AI technologies, of the kind that has led to large language models that's behind ChatGPT, has really changed the landscape of AI, and most significantly, it led to a new AI workflow, and by extension, has really significantly expanded the horizon of machine learning models. So the conventional approach that's shown on the left-hand side is to train task-specific machine learning models independent from each other, right? So each model has its own data curation, data collection, data engineering, as well as training and development process. And this is not only inefficient in training these models, but more importantly, it also leads to significant limitations because of the requirements of having sufficient amount of labeled data to be able to train each one of these task-specific models. So the emergence of foundation models really changed this. So if you move to the right-hand side, using the foundation model approach, we can train a very large model using self-supervised learning on a large amount of unlabeled data, right? So the resulting model, we call it foundation model because it has the capability, as demonstrated, as has been demonstrated by these large language models, to support many different downstream tasks, and it's able to do so with significantly reduced effort that's needed to train these task-specific models, and as well as reduce demand on the amount of labeled data that's required. And typically that leads to a 10 to 100 times of reduction. So this really means that now there are, not only it's much more efficient, but also now we are able to train models that are have not been possible before because of the lack of labeled data, right? So that's what I mean by the expansion of the horizons for machine learning models. And so that really opens up a lot of new opportunities. Now, so what does that mean for discoveries in healthcare and life sciences? The large language models, which have been the focus of foundation model development to date, has already demonstrated incredible abilities to digest and distill human knowledge from large amount of common crawl data, and to not only that, to discern logic from that knowledge, and then to perform inference on that logic, and from there to generate new text and new image based on prompts and instructions. And this has really led to really significant productivity enhancement, right? So as we have been observing across many, many different domains, this kind of capabilities can automate certain tasks. It can assist in many other tasks, and just across the board enhance productivity in many, many situations. So the question is, would we go beyond there? And we believe we now have really great opportunities to now harness that power to help drive new scientific and engineering discoveries to address some of the really pressing challenges that we're facing today. For example, the discovery of new therapeutics for many diseases for which we don't have a cure. But it's not straightforward, right? To do that, we need to go way beyond large language models. And so here are some of the important challenges that we believe are that we need to consider as we pursue these opportunities. The first one is we need to build new methodologies to be able to ingest and learn from many, many additional modalities beyond text and image. And more importantly, to be able to learn across modalities so that we can leverage these many, the rich data coming from many different modalities to be able to really capture in the case of biomedical research and drug discovery, the human physiology and the interactions within this physiology to be able to drive insights that can lead to new discoveries. And that not only leads to enhanced models, but also enhanced access, as I alluded to before, right? So you can pre-train full sets of features, but then access the downstream model and the capabilities of these models using the more accessible modalities. And the second area, the second challenge that we need to address is the trustworthiness of these foundation models. And we have already seen many situations where a lot of harm can come to use of some of these foundation models in different situations. And what a foundation model does to a very large degree depends on the data that it ingests. So data quality really matters. And so to that end, we have been developing and we're continuing to enhance AI tools to perform very aggressive filtering of the data. And for drug discovery in particular, we have been looking at, we have been very carefully curating and in many cases augmenting a lot of publicly available data sources such as PubChem, Zinc, and Campbell. Model quality also matters. So we have been building AI tools to enable more transparent and explainable AI workflow. We have been also working on constructing very comprehensive benchmarks, both in terms of data as well as benchmarking tasks. And we're looking into new ways of defining the pre-training tasks as well as pre-training strategies in order to arrive at representations that are more meaningful. The third area that's really important is explainability, and that's particularly important when we want to apply these AI technologies to new discovery for the purpose of being able to better identify boundaries and failure cases, as well as deriving more actionable insights. So that leads me to the last challenge, the fourth one, which is the incorporation of knowledge and mechanistic models. So scientific discovery is about nature, and for drug discovery and biomedical research, it's really about studying the human biological system and its interaction with external perturbations, right? So, we have already learned a lot about these human biological systems, and our knowledge are generally captured in either knowledge graphs or mechanistic models. So in order to apply AI to drive new discoveries, it makes sense to feed, when we train these foundation models, it makes sense to train them not just on raw data alone, but also to incorporate these mechanistic models and domain knowledge in order to basically achieve the insights that's more meaningful for the kind of new discoveries. And a good place to start, we believe, is to really take all of the information to build a specialized foundation model for drug discovery. So here we have the opportunity to really leverage these many different modalities, very rich data that you see some examples on the left-hand side and on the top, and use that to drive rich representations that really captures the interaction the human body and compound complex, right? So because in some ways, this is really the essence of drug discovery, because drug discovery is not just about identifying new molecules, but molecules that interact with human body in such a way that achieves desirable outcome while avoiding undesirable effects. And so to have a foundation model that truly captures these intrinsic and very complex interactions will have a really transformative effect on drug discovery. But that by itself is not sufficient. We also need so-called connector technologies. For example, AI-enhanced simulation and mechanistic models, so that we can use these to both assist in the training and validation of the foundation models, and also connect the foundation models to web experiments, right? So to be able to translate the results from the wet lab experiments to new directions, to guide the directions, new directions of exploration using these foundation models. So we believe this new set of AI technologies, which we could call them as Foundation Model Plus, can really bring together all early stages of drug discovery, including target identification, target validation, lead identification, and lead optimization through fine-tuning of downstream task-specific models for both the identification, credentialing, and prioritization of new targets, as well as the novel generation of new therapeutic candidates, both small molecules and biologics, and predict models for activity and property prediction, and many others. And so this ability for these new sets of AI models to connect molecules to biology to outcome really has the potential of finally bringing together all these early stages of drug discovery, which have traditionally been performed in a sequential and siloed manner, right? By doing so, we not only have the potential of really speed up the discovery process, but also to make discoveries, new discoveries that would have otherwise not been possible. So we are really at a very exciting time with a lot of great opportunity. And with that, I thank you for your attention and happy to take questions.
Thank you for your excellent talk. So we have just a couple of minutes to take some questions. Anybody from the audience? If not, then I can start. Okay. Thanks for your excellent talk, and the future. So what's your thought on the next frontier? Yeah, you show the last slide, but I'm asking even beyond that.
Yeah. So I guess I would just perhaps emphasize a little more even on that, right? So, we have all seen the power of large language models. Again, as I mentioned, it's already this type of foundation models and up-to-date focusing on large language models have already demonstrated great capabilities of enhancing productivity across the board. So, where do we go from there? What else can we do? There is, a lot of buzz, as we all know, out there about achieving general AI, this notion of making AI models behave more and more like humans. But in our view, actually, the more exciting and more impactful, in our view, next frontier is really in harvesting these the power of foundation models to new scientific and engineering advancements to help us, address a lot of these very important challenges that we have. So, for example, how do we connect all this information and data coming from different modalities to really truly understand human health state, disease states, and the progression. And this kind of holistic understanding could really point to more holistic way of therapeutic discovery. For example, by focusing on targets for early stages of pathological development that could potentially have impact on many, many downstream diseases instead of what we are doing now, which is largely treating symptoms, when it's really already too late to reverse disease progression. So there are really a lot of areas where new scientific discoveries could benefit from the power of foundation model and really benefit humanity.
Thank you so much. Anybody from the audience? Yeah.
So thank you for the inspiring talk. I'm Claudio Ordagno from University of Milan. Just wondering the impact of privacy and data protection on your foundational model, and specifically on the need of trustworthy and data privacy and data quality are often conflicting. So I was wondering if you took this into consideration, your thought on this.
Yeah, it is absolutely a very, very important question to address, right? So I touched on it a little bit in terms of data quality, and part of that is a lot of these privacy and considerations. And we do have a a lot of efforts in building AI tools to help assess data quality and filtering the data for things like bias, like in the case of large language models, hate, and as well as other potential harmful effects. And another way of addressing that is actually also tied to explainability, as I mentioned, right? So one use of explainability is to provide more systematic ways of identifying boundary conditions and failure cases. And this right now is done for foundation models in a very ad hoc manner, right? We are all familiar with the many famous cases of bizarre behavior coming from these foundation models when different people poke at it in many different ways. But because we don't really understand in most cases how these models really work, we're nowhere near actually identifying the true boundaries. And that could be very dangerous, right? Similar kind of lack of explainability also exists in traditional AI models in many cases. However, the stakes here is much higher because of the power of foundation models. So we believe for foundation models in particular, it's really important to have explainability and transparency for a lot of these use cases that we're trying to drive. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. So I had a question about foundation models. Is there any experience to suggest the scope of a foundation model? Namely, is there a one foundation model for pathology, another one for COVID studies? And a sort of related question is, to what extent should you use observed data and simulation? Do you combine them, and what experience is there in that?
Great questions, and that's all part of the frontier that I was just describing, right? So we know a lot about, like I said, foundation model up to date has been focused on just building large language models. We have very limited experience with other modalities up to now. And this question of should there be just one big model that does everything versus different foundation models doing different things, our belief really is there is no one model that rules them all. Most likely, you will need to build specialized foundation models for different domains and using different data. But then you would still be able to, the idea is to really leverage that self-supervised learning, leverage the ability to learn from large amount of unlabeled data. And then you'll be able to actually fine-tune these foundation models to different downstream tasks with relatively small amount of effort as well as smaller amount of labeled data. So that's where really the power of the foundation model comes from. And to achieve that, you don't have to aim for just one huge model for everything, right? Could very well be that a better way to go about it is to build smaller, specialized foundation models for different type of tasks. And there's already emerging evidence that shows that, in many cases that actually leads to better gain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? If not, then from the Congress and any other question? You have a question? Oh, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please. Sorry, I didn't notice that.
Thank you. Hey, Jianying, wonderful talk. I had the question actually related to the question that was made before regarding hate, abuse, and profanity, for example. I think it's very kind of intuitive and easy when we think about hate, abuse, and profanity outside of healthcare, for example, from newspapers or from other sources like more publicly available sources. When we talk about scientific papers, actually it becomes more and more tricky because actually sometimes, for example, for healthcare, the genomics, the DNA actually encloses some of the results for the drug discovery and so on. So how would you, I would say that becomes quite tricky, in understanding what are the information that we want to filter and what are the information that we actually want to feed to the model in order for them to understand the differences in outcomes and so on. So just if you have any comment on that, because I think it's very tricky and it's very hard to.
That's a great question, and I think that requires a lot of active research. My, intuition, this is really intuition, right? This remains to be tested and borne out, is in this particular case, it's perhaps not so much about filtering the data, but more about designing the appropriate pre-training tasks that actually draws attention to the type of data that leads to more intrinsic representations that's more meaningful for a range of downstream tasks versus other parts, right? Because that's really, in the training process, the big thing in the training process is to direct attention, if you will, of the foundation model to different parts of the data. And I think in this particular case, that's probably the more likely approach where you would be able to address that question versus designing, before you actually start the pre-training. But great question.
Thank you. That's a really great question. Actually, in the keynote, we have seen that really a lot of, high impact papers also, thank you for showing us that. And all of the thing, I think all of us learn, if you want to do really the next level, the collaboration, that way, IBM is doing that with all other universities. It's excellent and amazing.
We love to collaborate.
It's amazing, and you are leading whole efforts. We are really very grateful that you are here at this Congress as our keynote. So we give a big hand for Dr. Hope.
Thank you.